At this time, I am honored to introduce Laura Segal, AAUW's National Senior Vice President of Communications and External Relations. And she's going to be speaking on 2020 Vision, Fighting for Equity. Hi, Laura.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I'm actually sad I wasn't able to travel out to Colorado to see you all. And, clearly this is a very unusual year all around. And I'm really impressed and excited to see nearly 100 participants on today, and want to convey the appreciation and thankfulness of all the national office and all of AUW, from around other places around the country, to the leadership, to all of the members who are joining today, to all the members throughout the state. And we're really energized this year with a lot of the action that's been going on. It's been really great to hear what is going on a really packed legislative calendar. I just want to make sure you can hear me.
We can hear you fine. Okay,
great. It looked frozen for a minute. That's the Zoom life is a little bit challenging. I also want to acknowledge and appreciate all of the members who participate in the Legacy Circle, who are involved in different committees and different organizations within, or different subcommittees and so forth with the national organization, and all the work that's been going on in Colorado. It sounds like a huge amount of effort and lots of activity. And I wish, this is usually at the beginning of these conversations when I visit states, is to have people stand up and express how long they've been a member at AUW. And it's one of my favorite things to do. And I don't want to fill up the chat box by asking people to do that today, but I know that so many of you have been really engaged and active with AUW for so long. My own grandmother was a member of AUW, as is my mother and myself. So I'm a third generation AUW legacy. So, it's very near and dear to my heart, and I know that it is to so many of you. So I wanted to start by sharing some slides. Let's see, it looks like the host has disabled screen sharing. Is there a way to enable that by any chance?
Carolyn or Susan?
I did. Would you check again? I did it.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
You bet.
All right. Sorry, it takes a second to set it up now. Sorry, it didn't go to where I thought it would be. Sorry, usually it's on the set one. I apologize. There we go. So thank you again, Paula, for the introduction. We did title this talk that we were going to present, even at the very beginning of 2020, is Fighting for Equity. And we really at AUW are in a moment in time that's meeting our mission, or really asking us to rise even further to AUW's mission, which is equity for all. And there's been different variations of how that's been expressed or described throughout the years, but dating back to even when my grandmother was joining AUW, it has been a mission that's been focused on how do we make sure women and women of color and all of society is reflecting and valuing people and getting the same and fair treatments and opportunities. And the events of this year has just infused that to a whole new level. Obviously, no one would have seen all of the things coming that happened this year so far, and we're not even uh, we're about 2/3 the way through the year so far, and don't even know still what's going to come. But coronavirus has obviously just impacted the country in ways that no one would have expected. I know it's been a challenge for everybody listening today, and many of us are more fortunate than others in the country and the world. But within our membership, we have a whole variation of different circumstances that people are under. And as we as an organization are looking at equity and fighting for equality for women and girls, the coronavirus really has impacted women and girls in particular ways that have stretched some of the inequalities and taken them in unfortunate directions. And if you look at the composition of the workforce, for instance, a majority of low-income workers are women, more than around 60%. A lot of those workers lack health benefits and health insurance, or as Betty was talking about with paid family leave and even sick leave, a lot of these workers don't have those benefits, and they are still going to work and often out of the home. And if they are still employed, or a lot of them are disproportionately getting laid off or having impacts to service businesses and so forth. And so it's all raising lots of different policy and practice agendas that AUW has been in the thick of fighting for at a more intense level. Women are way more represented in consultant work and in the gig economy, and often those jobs don't have benefits. More retired women are living below poverty than men. It's about a 2-to-1 ratio. Women hold more student debt than men, and now they're graduating to not just the pay gap, but also to unprecedented unemployment. So there's a lot of work for us to do. And it sounds really daunting and hopeless, but I think there's also a lot of hope and energy within the membership and our advocates to work on taking this moment to push not just for the changes to where we used to be, but to advance some of the issues and agendas that we've been fighting for decades. Obviously, also the heightened attention and recognition of racial inequality in the country, and seeing these issues come front and center at such a dramatic way, especially when COVID is also impacting communities of color at such disproportionate rates. And that reflects the underlying and systemic racism of health inequities that these populations are vulnerable and impacted as well. But it really looks and challenges AUW and every organization to think about our policies and practices and positions as we're gaining and looking at different understandings of racial equality and how to adapt policies and practices to address systemic and underlying racial inequities, and not just in a different way and in a different intensity than we have. And AUW has been an active member in the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights for quite a while. And it's an organization that brings together about 600 of the leading civil rights and human rights groups. And so we actively and participate and join into lots of the different legislative asks and activities at that national level. And almost all of those organizations also have grassroots and tentacles throughout the states, as we do. And so it really shows the power that AUW brings to being a participant, and what we can do to help be part of and also learn from all of these different organizations and forces. And so we have been actively putting out statements and op-eds, and what we also benefit from is between our members and especially our alumni fellowship group, some of the really leading strong voices on equity issues and doing studies and so forth, and folks like Nell Painter and Keisha Blaine and others who have been some of the most vocal and well-publicized people in getting out statements for women of color and what we can do at this time. And we're working at the national office to help promote and give platforms and share power to make sure those are heard. So I just put up a little bit of our statement that we put out in reaction to some of the incidents from earlier this year, and talking about how AUW, like every organization, we have to look at ourselves and our own practices and our own histories to look at how the world is now, and things that we should come to think about changing, and how to take that national reckoning of where we are now, that we need to make sure that we aren't perpetuating or acting to further the value gap of different people in the country. And all of this is wrapped into all of the policy agenda that Betty and others have been talking about today. AUW's strategic plan from last year, or I guess it was 2018, looked at the different segments of our priorities and focus of economic security, education, and foundational rights. And as you mentioned, these have been central to AUW for as long as it's existed, but looking at them in the context of today and the different issues and ways that we can address them within the context of COVID and Black Lives Matter and inclusion and equity and diversity in different ways than we've done before. And so these are the top priorities that we are focusing on from a national lens on policy. And it really carries through to policy programs and our full agenda as an integrated organization. The basic things of equal pay that we've been fighting for since I think it was 1888 when the first equal pay AUW report was put out. Paid and family leave right now with COVID, where you have people leaving the workforce because they don't have childcare or kids at home, not having educational opportunities, continued workplace harassment issues, raising the minimum wage for economic security, and looking at things within that security lens of, we're going to have our new Simple Truth report coming out, where you can look at differences in history and how these decisions have impacted why some professions have benefits and some don't. And most of the ones that women dominate either have almost paternalistic types of benefits in place of higher value wages, like teaching and nursing and so forth, versus some of the service industries which had roots in looking at those as being women's work or work of people of color, and they were left out of things like labor negotiations and unions and different benefit packages, and it was just valued differently in our society, and that's continued to carry through. Retirement security right now is obviously huge and impacts our membership so strongly. Protecting pregnant workers, still Title IX. Betsy DeVos and others at the Department of Education have put out new guidelines that have really rolled back a lot of the work on Title IX, and we're still working to push that forward, continuing to put in recommendations. I think there were 4,000 or so comments that we and other organizations were able to rally to get to the Department of Education to keep pushing for those. And then even at a national level, as that's continuing to have those struggles, we can work with the colleges and universities themselves. We for a long time have focused on student debt and the disproportionate effect on women, and things like for-profit colleges and how they, particularly as more women are involved in those areas, or enrolled in those schools, they'd get disproportionate, almost preyed upon predatory debt. We are.
Excuse me, Laura, can I just interrupt you 1 second? Do
Sure.
you have your slides up? We're not seeing any slides.
Oh, you're not seeing the slides?
No,
oh,
ma'am.
No. Sorry, I was talking from the slides. I probably didn't make a lot of sense without the slides.
Well, not totally, but we weren't sure if you had them up or not. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but
No, thank you. Are you seeing my screen?
I see you, but I don't see
See
your
me.
screen.
Um,
And Laura, I'm looking at it from the attendee side, and all we see is you on the attendee side also.
okay. I'm sorry for that. It's saying that the screen share is working. Susan, is there a way to maybe turn it on and off again for the permissions?
I will see if I can, you bet.
Okay.
Let's see. Go into the webinar settings. It says panelists are allowed to share their screen.
Okay. Let's see. Can you see my screen now or just me again?
Just you.
Well, I don't want to take all of your time. Technical
Yeah, appreciate that.
things. So yeah, I'll keep trying to walk through the presentation, but try to make it hopefully more interesting with
Well, and perhaps you can send us the slideshow and we'll send it out to everyone.
Sure, I definitely will.
Okay.
My apologies for that, because it's a lot more attractive to see the different slides than me just describing them. But I'll try to adapt. Yeah, I was going through different pictures and so forth about the different issues I was describing. So I'll adapt as I'm going. So what I was looking at is kind of the three buckets of our strategic plan of economic security, education, and foundational rights, and how we're pushing forward on those different areas. And then wanted to share some of the great successes that we've had from last year. And obviously this year, a lot of those things are going to have to pivot or have been impacted in different ways. But some of the great things that we have been able to achieve. Last year, we trained over 100,000 women in Work Smart and Start Smart, and really appreciate all the efforts that different branches and states have done with Work Smart Online and working and helping to recruit different universities to be part of that. Overall, we have actually trained about 180,000 women altogether. So with 100,000 just last year. And this year, what we are doing is as colleges and universities have closed down, and also where people can't go to in-person sessions anymore with WorkSmart, my colleague Gloria Blackwell and her team on the program side have quickly pivoted to doing lots of webinars. And we just received our third installment of a $500,000 a year grant from Coca-Cola Foundation. And it's specifically targeting working with historically Black colleges and universities and a few other colleges and university systems, the flagships, where there are high enrollment of different, particularly of students of color. And so we just have signed now 23 MOUs with different HBCUs and getting out a lot of those workshops. And because of the situation with COVID, where we've talked about how women are graduating to just such an unprecedented unemployment and work situation, that we're trying to create a lot of career support and packages for those graduates to work with, and working with the HBCUs to kind of complement the efforts that they can do when they're really overstretched right now. Last year, we also put out 3 of our research reports: The Simple Truth About the Pay Gap, our Deeper in Debt report, which shows the 2/3 of the $1 trillion of debt in the country is held by women, and a report called Limiting Our Livelihoods, which looked at sexual harassment in the workplace and took a really long view and included a survey of I think hundreds of members participated in from around the country of their experiences throughout their lives and how that impacted their career trajectories. And this year we unfortunately did have to cancel the Nick Whistle conference, but in 2019, we held that and had 800 students from around the country, often on generous scholarships from branches and states, who came to attend that. And for this coming year, we're looking at a model of doing a virtual Nick Whistle or some sort of hybrid situation. So we're pivoting with that as well. I also wanted to talk about, in terms of pay laws, that, sorry, I'm trying to convert my slides so they make sense, that states around the country are really pushing forward on equal pay laws, and a lot of things like the family paid leave laws that you have being proposed in Colorado are helping seed those movements of changing this wraparound economic security package for women. But last year, 11 states passed new pay equity laws. Some of them were strengthening old laws that were on the books. There's now only one state that doesn't have any form of pay equity law, and Kate Nielsen and others in our policy organization or office have really worked hard to get that second to last state, which was Mississippi, and now we're just trying to get the last one on board. But we're continuing to strengthen and expand those, and hopefully next year we can also re-raise the Paycheck Fairness Act and other legislation within Congress to help forward that at the national level. But it's really the state, local, and national interchange where right now you can see a lot more action going on in the states and seeding that, but often it requires the state law and the federal law to balance pushing those forward. And it's been a long time since the 1963 Equal Pay Act. I have a slide of AUW members surrounding President Kennedy as he signed that. But even we can see as it's the law of the land, it still takes a lot of advocacy and pushing and practice to make this happen. So we're learning practices and expanding those on how to really try to make pay equity a reality. So things like banning asking women for their pay history, which perpetuates gaps over time, where if you were paid lower in your first job, you're going to be paid lower in your second job, and transparency for bans where people coming in can see what others in the field are getting. So those are things we teach in the Work Smart workshops, but also reinforcing it with legislation and policy and practice. Hopefully we can really move the needle much faster than we have. I mentioned we're putting out the Simple Truth report later this month, and it may actually end up being in early October. There's new data coming out from the federal government, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that we use to base that on. And we don't expect much movement in the actual pay gap numbers, but I think one thing that you'll see in this year's report will be a real focus on the difference between the impact of the pay gap on different women of color experience it at much more dramatic rates than white women, and women in different sectors and professions, and how those gaps are working. We're also working with a group called the EOS Foundation, which has put out a study for the last several years in Massachusetts, looking at the pay gap and the power gap of folks in higher education, and how few women still are in leadership positions in colleges and universities, despite the fact more than half of professors are now women and more than half of students are. So there's not the pipeline gap to blame that on, and trying to really raise that there's still the bias in hiring and promotion practices and value gap there as well. Also, we had a great victory earlier this year with the Legal Action Fund, or Legal Advocacy Fund, where we've supported for a long time a plaintiff, Aileen Rizzo in California, who had taken legal action with help from LAF and some other support, where she had learned that she was making far less than a colleague who had less experience. And it was based on one of these issues where, because she had been paid less in her previous job, she continued to get paid less in her new job, using salary history as the marker. And the Supreme Court turned down hearing an appeal to a case, and that was in large part to the work of the Legal Advocacy Fund support for her continued efforts there, and she wouldn't be able to have pursued that without AUW's help. We also have continued with our fellowships and grants program, which is one of the obviously most endowed and strongest supported long-term efforts that AUW has kind of in perpetuity, and we're thrilled for. And we just announced the latest education and training grants to about 250 scholars. And as you can imagine right now, it's one of the most complicated situations we've ever experienced, where a lot of the scholars coming from other countries or from even within the country where you have different virtual learning issues or campuses being closed or opened, where students have been figuring out, can they even pursue what they had applied for and so forth. So it's been a very, very challenging year for those scholars and our F&G team. But a lot of those students have hit the campuses virtually or in person this year, or there are a lot of deferments for next year. So a lot of unique situations that's created a hurdle there, but we're excited to have this new class coming in. And if you do get a chance to check out on the website, we have a lot more information now about different alumni and things that highlight some of the work that some of the alumni are doing. And we're hoping to continue to expand that in this coming year. Another thing we've really worked hard on over the last couple of years is building what we've called the Equity Network, where I know there's a lot of excitement and enthusiasm for how do we keep engaging additional generations of women and members. It's a little bit of a different model where we've really surveyed the landscape and done a lot of competitive analyses or surveying women themselves of what they're interested in joining. And, you know, obviously the classic membership model is a little different for this generation. And so particularly with COVID and all of the distance programming that people are doing, we've been offering a lot of webinars to different folks who had been participants of our Work Smart program, Start Smart, folks on campuses and working to engage them in AUW and our work and become advocates to really take part in the Action Network and so forth. So it's hopefully working to expand and engage this generation of different constituencies and different generations to see and feel the value of AUW. We've been putting out.
Excuse me, Laura.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We're kind of on a time schedule here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So I want to allow for questions from our audience. So if you could conclude and then let's allow some time for questions, we would really appreciate that.
Sure. I'm sorry to run long. And I'm very sorry the slides aren't working because I know it sounds probably a lot more like a laundry list. I think the two things I'd like to conclude with are making sure to let people know to focus on getting in touch with our policy group on our Get Out the Vote efforts. This is going to be a monumental year, and we're doing a lot of work with that. And then also just to raise as part of the conversation within looking at equity and inclusion as part of AUW, that this year again, there will be, or this coming year in 2021, a vote again on the membership requirement for the organization. And I know that is a challenging issue with the organization and its history, but just really wanted to put out, I think you'll see, or you will be seeing a lot of communication from Julia Brown and others on the board and other members about the need to think about having this this requirement on the books when we're working to build an inclusive organization, that we're not devaluing or looking at putting all of the work and accomplishments that people have done around their educations aside, but that in this moment in time in the country, it is hard to talk about being an inclusive and open and supportive organization when we have this exclusive requirement that's really defining us to external audiences in ways that we don't. I think that's not the intention of what it is. So it's not to radically change the organization. It's more to have that as a policy change. And that, I think that's something we're going to be communicating a lot in this coming 6 months. So sorry again, and I really do wish you'd seen the slides, because it's a lot more engaging than me rattling it off. But I'll look forward to questions.
Okay. From Jill Smith, she wanted to know if you're saying foundational rights instead of education as one of the 3 buckets of the strategic plan.
So the buckets are education, economic security, and either foundational rights or leadership. Those kind of have gone hand in hand as the 3 buckets. So education is still one of the strong buckets. Those are all also up on the website. And if you haven't looked at the website lately, we did redo the national website this past year. It was launched in April, and hopefully those areas are much more clear. If you go to the issues, they're laid out, and you can see where the different segments are listed and have explainers on all the different things that we're working on.
So then Jessie Summers wanted to know, what were the names of the people pushing women of color forward? I think that must have been early in your talk. What were the names of people pushing women of color forward?
I think if you're wondering within AUW's efforts lately, where if that's what you're referring to, where I mentioned Keisha Blaine is one that has been very well published recently, who's one of the AUW fellow alumni. We have worked with Nell Painter, who was one of the first and highlighted prominent women of color at Princeton University, who has been out there very vocal on the issue. But I think what we're trying to do within all of our national efforts is to align with fellows or other AUW members where we can elevate and work with folks as partners who are women of color, instead of explaining for or trying to be the voice of people sharing the podiums and raising voices collectively. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Jill, but if you have or Jessie, if you have other follow-up, let me know, or also feel free to email me too.
Then a couple of people wanted to know the last state that we need to pass pay equity laws.
I think it's I have to double check because I didn't have it right in front of me. It's either Arkansas or Mississippi. But I will double check.
Okay. Then from Gail Wilson, AAUW uses the term equity as opposed to equality. Would you explain the difference?
Sure. There was a real pivot in that language about 15 years ago in a lot of equity and equality organizations, where the sense was equality was the thought of treating everyone the same, where equity is thinking about looking at the obstacles and hurdles that keep people from being treated the same. So there are a lot of interesting ways where I think of it most graphically, where at an organization I worked at before, where if you gave everyone the same size bike and asked them to all get on, and it's a male bike that's pretty high up for someone who's like 6 feet tall, and said, this is your bike, now you all have a bike and you're equal. versus, I'm 5'3", I need a shorter bike. There's children need a different bike. A disabled person would need a different type of bike. There are different reasons why people aren't being just the same is being treated the same isn't the same as having the same opportunities, or if you need different levers or there are different obstacles that get in the way, or that especially things like systemic racism or systemic sexism that really have held women of color and women back in a whole different way. So you have like one arm tied behind your back while you're trying to be equal still. So that's where that pivot has come from. So it does sometimes sound like jargon, but that's where the field uses it differently.
Okay, from Marcy Young, would you tell us the difference in the use of our national dues and the use of the greatest needs funds? She says, as a branch leader, I want to be able to effectively promote greatest needs fund.
So the dues themselves pay for about 15% of AUW's budget annually. We have money that comes from our the investments on the endowments, from contributions from other sources of money. And when people do give their dues, that is going to support AUW overall. Giving to greatest needs would be up and above beyond paying your dues in terms of giving to the organization as a donation. And what's happened in the past is a lot of people, as you know, have designated their donations to things like the Eleanor Roosevelt Fund or to a grants program or LAF and so forth. And then that money becomes restricted just to those programs. And to be quite honest, those programs are fairly well funded, but we then can't use that money to do things like support the passage of equal pay laws or work smart programming or reaching out to support STEM in schools. So it's the greatest needs is in the donation category of how do we increase donations to support those kind of efforts as well as those endowed programs.
Then the last question that we have is from Olga Ott, and she wants to know how the impact of efforts for equal pay is evaluated.
It's definitely a complicated question, and I think what happened in terms of history was there was a huge bump from the 60s to the 80s where it was around 50 cents on the dollar and got up to around 80 cents on the dollar. And then it really has stalled out for about 20, 30 years where it's increased at only about a nickel since then. And so I think the way that we've evaluated is looking at in specific employers or within different segments of occupations, and to see those shrinks or the kind of convergence of the pay and the gaps decreasing. And when we've seen things like salary transparency or ending asking for salary histories as part of interview processes, those pay gaps do shrink in those companies, those fields. Within, say, government, it tends to be smaller because those salaries are often published and publicly available. So taking those kind of practices that we've seen work and evaluating that through looking at companies or industries and how the gaps have closed in those, that's been how we've diffused how policies may work or don't work.
Thank you so much, Laura, for joining us today and giving us a little insight of national. And sorry the slides didn't work, but we understood a lot of what you were saying without.
Well, I apologize. I wish we could have done that differently, but thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us very much.
Well, thank you again for all the great work.
Thank you.